Good morning. Thank you. Good to see everyone bright and early. Yesterday we had a real tour of the horizon on how governments and business are approaching this problematic conversion of economic activity and national security. And last night we had, I thought, a really good discussion with three senior Australian officials on how they are basically mainstreaming economic security in what they do. Today we're going to turn to specific sectors and themes. Before I introduce our first panel, let me just let you know that our next big conference for the Studies Center is November 20. And it's our second Sydney International Strategy Forum. And we have former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, former NSC Senior Director Matt Pottinger, Stephanie Murphy, who was the leader of the Blue Dog Democrats, the centrist Democratic faction in the House of Representatives, the number 2 from the Business Roundtable in Washington, former National Security Advisor Akihisa Nagashima from Japan, and others from Australia. The focus will be the future of American leadership and a contested Asia. So we'll be doing this a few weeks after the US election, and we'll sort of look through the rubble or whatever we have at that time to try to figure out what it means for the region, and in particular, not just about the US, although our first name is the US Studies Center, but how do we see and how do these experts from Tokyo, Washington, Canberra see the unfolding competition and economic issues in the region. And there is a discount code on page 26 of your program. So we're becoming very commercial. So page 26, if you'd like to join us again in November. If you want to think about it, you can always register online later and lose the discount. So we're going to turn to two major sectors, if you will. Our first panel will focus on tech. And then the next panel after that will focus more on energy, resources, minerals. Let me bring up to the stage to moderate the first panel Helen Mitchell. She is a non-resident fellow for economic security with us at the center, a Sir Roland Wilson scholar at the ANU, a former diplomat and Commonwealth Treasury official. Helen, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm really lucky to be here with the US Studies Center while I'm temporarily stepping back from government to do some long-term research on economic security. Welcome to your morning session. So this morning, some really interesting solo speakers and then a plenary discussion on technology. So to set the scene, we've been sort of dancing around the issue of what is really the tip of the spear in the economic security battleground, which is technology and the frontier of that technology and the goods that actually fuel development of those technologies. So really interesting set of speakers. We're going to start with Emily Kilcrease. We're welcoming her back this morning. She was on stage yesterday. And once again, we're going to benefit from her deep expertise and experience actually working on and implementing these tools in the United States government. And now we're all benefiting from her public work at the Center for New American Security, CNAS, where she looks at energy, economics, and security. So welcome back, please, Emily Kilcrease this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Helen, and thank you to everyone at the center. It's been a really fantastic set of conversations so far and looking forward to more today. I'm honored to share a few thoughts today on how technology intersects with the economic security agenda, and indeed why, in many ways, technology is really at the core of these debates, at least for the United States, but certainly globally as well. There's been quite a bit of discussion already about the idea of a small yard, high fence. And I thought perhaps I could spare you more on that, but really I can't. So apologies. And in the interest of continuing to abuse metaphors, I will see if we can beat this horse a bit more dead this morning when we talk about the small yard high fence. And I wanted to start with a little bit of a look back at how tech policy has evolved over the last 2 to 3 decades in the US, with a particular focus on how the US government has managed the balance between economic growth and innovation on the one hand, and its security interests on the other hand, and of course looking at this deeply in the context of our relationship with China. And I want to start us back in time at a moment before economic security was so hot of a topic. And I'll start with the aughts and the 2010s and really the moment when China was acceding to the WTO. So put yourself in that mindset. US policy at that time was geared towards ensuring US technological leadership through a run faster strategy. The idea was that US tech firms had to have access to and be competitive in global markets, including, importantly, in the China market. This scale would give them the revenues they needed to plow back into R&D, which was seen as the real secret sauce for remaining at the cutting edge of complex technologies. There would be a virtuous cycle of markets leading to scale, leading to innovations, leading to US leadership across a range of technology sectors, which would allow the US firms to continually run faster than competitors elsewhere, including those in China. And this was not just a sop to commercial interests. There was a real strategic logic behind it. The US military was deeply dependent on commercial capabilities to power its platforms. The military was a buyer, not a builder, and it did not drive markets in core technologies, such as chips, for example, where it made up a really small percentage of global market demand. So US security interests were dependent on US companies being the best globally, so that that tech could be spun back into the military. And it was an approach that had huge benefits for military innovation, but also one that left the national security apparatus dependent on global markets in the commercial sector. During this period, defensive policies such as export controls were seen as a backstop, not the center of our policy. And they were intended to ensure that the most advanced technologies were not used for military purposes in countries of concern. There was also a belief and a policy intent to differentiate between civilian and military end uses or end users in China, with the goal of facilitating trade of dual-use goods for commercial purposes in most cases, so long as the US was confident that it was staying 1 to 2 generations ahead of China. And this 1 to 2 generations idea was actually the original conception of the small yard, high fence idea. So this idea is not new, although the meaning has changed quite substantially. But by the mid-2010s, so kind of in the middle of the Obama administration, the strategy of running faster had begun to fray. All of a sudden, it seemed China had become a major technological power in its own right. The West was taken by surprise, for example, when all of a sudden Huawei started to dominate global telecommunications networks. And we didn't have a response. We didn't have a competitor who could beat Huawei in those markets. The West was also put on high alert when the Made in China 2025 vision, China was declaring its intent to dominate strategic technology sectors globally. And that would, of course, be at the expense of the US and other Western industrialized democracies. And there was increasing concern that not only was the playing field not level, it was unclear that the US and partners could make it level. After all, the US had been trying to do that with a range of different approaches for years. We had strategic dialogues, lots of talking, we had trade litigation, more trade litigation, and none of this was working. There was increasingly high levels of frustration within policymaking circles at China's continued drift away from free market principles and away from competition that was anything except for on China's own terms. And amid this intensifying technological competition from China, there's of course another layer that we need to add in, which is the evolving security layer. Because it's at this time that China was becoming more of a technological power, there were other trends at play. This is when we start to see an increasing spirit of adventure in their foreign policy. We see Xi's increasing authoritarianism. Liz did a great job yesterday outlining some of these trends. And importantly, we see a real increase in China's military capabilities over this period. I'd like to look at the annual DoD report, Department of Defense report on China's military capabilities, the China Power Report. And if you look at this report in 2001, the year that China acceded to the WTO, our own Defense Department assessed, and I quote, that the technological level of China's defense industrial complex is too far behind that of the West to produce weaponry that could challenge a technologically advanced foe, such as the United States, for an indefinite period of time. Fast forward to more recent reports, and the assessment is fundamentally different. China's military modernization has yielded capabilities across maritime, aerospace, space, cyber, nuclear domains, and these pose a genuine threat to the United States. And China may now be able to fight and win wars against a strong enemy and to counter interventions by a third party in their periphery. Very coded language, but I think we all know what that means. When President Trump took office in early 2017, these were the dynamics his administration faced. And obviously, his response, as history now knows, was more aggressive and disruptive than his predecessors. But I like to start with kind of this origin story to point out how all of these trends were very present, at least in the US policymaking circles, well before 2017. The ground had shifted fundamentally in the geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And we're simply not going back to the days of trying to encourage China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system. we no longer think that we can change China. And so our strategy related to technology competition has shifted in important ways. Instead of changing China, or relying on China's own economic self-interest to motivate it to change, which of course was the logic of the WTO accession, our strategy now relies much more heavily on efforts to constrain China from taking actions that are against US interests or actions that would undermine the international rules-based order. And many of these efforts, of course, to constrain China are playing out in the technology sphere. So what does that strategy look like today? The clearest articulation of how the US intends to compete with China technologically, is in a speech by Jake Sullivan. And it's not the Brookings speech that we've heard quite a bit about already here in this conference. It's a 2022 speech that he gave at the Special Competitive Studies Project Summit in Washington, DC. And in this speech, Jake Sullivan declared that the United States intends to stay as far ahead as possible in key technologies that will be force multipliers for US national security interests. And he specifically noted a set of compute-related technologies that would be priorities, namely AI, chips, and quantum information technologies. And with those 5 small words, as far ahead as possible, he reset the entire agenda for the tech competition. So no longer would the United States try to stay just a generation or 2 ahead of Chinese competitors. Instead, we would try to freeze them in place. No longer would the United States try to differentiate between civilian and military end uses or end users in China, a task that had been complex, if not outright impossible, in the eyes of many US policymakers. Instead, the US was publicly naming the zero-sum competition for global leadership in the technologies that may matter most for future military competition, and declaring that any advance by China in these areas, whether civilian or military, was a de facto national security risk to the United States. And the speech was followed by a series of supporting regulatory actions, including wide-ranging and novel export controls on advanced AI, advanced chips, and advanced supercomputing, as well as proposed restrictions on US investments in China in these and related areas. And combined with the revived US industrial policy, the strategy is now trying to pull multiple policy levers to essentially shock the shape of critical tech supply chains into a more geopolitically desirable shape. This approach, of course, was not without its critics. Industry, for one, was not very pleased, arguing that it runs exactly counter to the intuition of the run faster strategy and arguing that it would cost them important R&D resources. I will admit that I'm not incredibly sorry feeling for firms like NVIDIA these days. If you take a look at the stock market, they seem to be doing quite fine. It's also fair to say that many close US allies were not quite ready to go this far and to declare entire tech ecosystems in China essentially off limits. And in part, I think this disconnect comes from sometimes a perception that the US measures are being taken for protectionist or competitiveness reasons, as opposed to being guided by a real national security rationale. To be clear, I don't think that's the case. I do think these are really national security-based actions. But it is also true that these actions, if they are effective, will have economic consequences for China. The technology that we're now putting in the small yard is technology that, by our own admission, will be fundamental to future economic prosperity and growth, as well as to future security interests. So perhaps the yard isn't that small after all. But there is a caveat. I said if these measures are effective. And there's quite a few reasons why they could fall short. And while noting I'm generally supportive of these policies, let me explain all the reasons why they might not work. So first, of course, is that the new policy of controls is predominantly a US approach so far. There's been some ad hoc alignment around semiconductor manufacturing equipment, but in reality, the measures of US partners are not a one-for-one match with what the US did. And it remains unclear whether the US has achieved strategic alignment with partners on what the right tech control approach is, or whether we've had simply a limited tactical success. And without a broader base of international partners that align both strategically and tactically with the US on tech controls, our so-called technology choke points will become fragile over time. Tech companies retain their place in global value chains through continuous cutthroat competition and innovation. And replacing a key company in a complex advanced tech supply chain is a very complicated task. It requires a significant amount of patient investment, a high level of technical sophistication, a lot of money, but it can be done. And there's often a sense in US policy circles that tech choke points can be weaponized, similarly to how we use financial sanctions, which rely on the role of the US dollar in global finance. But this is a mistaken perception. Companies, over time, are replaceable in a way that the US dollar is not. And foreign firms backfilling for US firms in China is one problem, but it's not the only problem this policy might face. There's also a really high incentive for European or Asian firms to design out US technology or US components, simply so that they don't have to worry about being subjected to the long arm of US export controls. And designing out US tech is a perfectly rational response if firms want to maintain commercial autonomy and if their own governments aren't imposing similar controls. And indeed, we've seen this happen before if you look at our satellite industry and control policy in the 1990s. And of course, China may simply innovate around the controls, and there's some evidence that they're starting to do this with at least a bit of success already. So those are potential pitfalls for the US strategy related to choke point technologies, where the US has a clear advantage in global markets. But that's also not the only area of technology subject to intensified competition. There are a range of technologies where China is on par or in many cases ahead of the US. And the question is not how to stay as far ahead as possible, but how to catch up. And here we're talking about clean energy technologies, batteries, legacy chips. And the US has had to come up with a new playbook for catch-up technologies. It's included a mix of industrial policy support, tariffs, et cetera. And the objective, of course, is to avoid creating new dependency on China in some of these supply chains, like clean energy supply chains, as we're also trying to move forward robustly with the climate transition. And whether it's in catch-up technologies or choke point technologies, it's clear that the US is trying to enact a hard pivot away from past policies of managing the tech competition with China. And I applaud the ambition and innovation of these efforts, but as I wrap up my comments, I want to leave us with two thoughts on how the US, working with its international partners, can round out its strategy and be more effective. First, in the US, and I say this with great affection as a former bureaucrat, we need to completely redo our economic security bureaucracy. It is not fit for this particular moment. The role that economic security is playing in US foreign policy has fundamentally changed over the last 5 to 10 years, but our institutions, our budgets, our expertise is fundamentally the same, and that just won't work. We need economists and data scientists and industry experts to tell us if our controls are working and try to project the impact of future controls. We need strategists to envision how economic security tools can be used in potential conflict scenarios. We need negotiators who can work with international partners to build new institutions and coordination frameworks to align economic security policies amongst like-minded friends. And today, we really don't have any of that. And without it, the economic security agenda will fail. Secondly, US economic security attempts will also fail if the US doesn't match what has become a heavily defensive strategy with an affirmative vision of what US leadership in the global economy can be in this economic security era. And I'm sorry to say that I don't think IPEF is that vision. I also don't think that the other Jake Sullivan speech at Brookings is really that vision. I believe that speech fundamentally misrepresented the contours of prior US trade policy as being all about tariffs, which isn't quite right. But it was right that trade policy needs to look different moving forward. And the question and the challenge for this generation of trade and economic security experts is, what does it look like? What should trade policy look like if we're centering resiliency and security alongside open markets and economic efficiency? And I would argue that we need to shift away from this binary model that we've had that's based on a presumption of openness with narrow room for exceptions related to national security. That model is not fit for our geopolitical moment. And it also leaves itself open to abuse as governments shove all manner of actions under a national security framing. I'll give a plug for some work we have coming out from CNAS next week. So we've got a paper coming out called Disorderly Conduct, how US-China geopolitical competition upended the global economic order. And we argue that we should reframe our conception of rules in the global economic order, not around this binary construct of it's either openness or it's national security, but we should think about things instead in categories of 3 interests. Hard power interests, those economic activities that are related to our military capabilities, resiliency interests, and then commercial interests related to non-strategic sectors. And each of these interests will have a different competitive character with different policy goals and policy instruments that would be applicable in the pursuit of these interests. And the paper calls for the US to engage with international partners on a deliberate effort to create new norms around government interventions in the economy related to the pursuit of their hard power and resiliency interests, with the idea that we need to create a new global economic order that meets today's geopolitical conditions. And this new order would have a role for the WTO as the baseline standard for engaging in rules-based trade around the world, but there would be a lot of action outside of the WTO, a much more ambitious agenda of norms building and in some cases institution building with like-minded allies, doing things like creating economic security agreements to bring defensive tools and proactive tools into trade agreements in a way that we've never done before. And I can't imagine a better country actually to start that sort of quest with than the US and Australia working together, where there are so many of the building blocks already in place that could form the foundation of a really strong economic security partnership. We've got an FTA that probably needs updating. We've got AUKUS. We've got investment screening cooperation. And I think there's the question of how do we build on that? How do we create a strong alliance that recognizes and addresses both our common and sometimes our very different economic security needs? So it's only by working together that I think we're going to meet this ambitious new task and meet the moment of where we are in our economic security era. And I hope we take that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and what an interesting agenda to be setting for the United States as it moves into elections at the end of this year and really setting that economic security agenda up. So next speaker is another coup for the United States Study Centre, a representative from one of the world's tech giants. Mike Ye is the Regional Vice President and Associate General Counsel responsible for Microsoft's corporate, external and legal affairs team across Asia. And Mike really is that person that can sit at the intersection of technology and business and give us a commercial perspective. So please welcome to the stage Mike Ye.
First, thank you very much, Helen. Thank you, Emily, for the overview and the insights. And thank you also to the United States Study Center for convening this group on a very timely topic. Navigating the shift from a vertical to horizontal world is absolutely something that is top of mind for us as a company, but also a trend that we see clearly across Asia Pacific. I'm not going to talk about a small yard, high fence today, but I will talk about the role of technology and what is an increasingly common phrase, the new lattice work. The world in 2024 is an uncertain place and one of staggering contrasts. More citizens will cast votes in elections this year than in any other year. And yet the institutions of democracy are struggling under immense strain. Voter disinformation and misinformation being just one example of a new strain. The Asia-Pacific region is experiencing geopolitical tensions and competition, but we're also seeing an increase in bi- and multilateral agreements. Technology, as evidenced by AI, is advancing at a pace and sophistication unseen before in human history. And as AI develops, so too does the desire for governments to ensure that they are not left behind. In this environment, it is not surprising that there is more and more talk of the importance of a lattice strategy. It's increasingly clear that governments, defense forces, civil society, and the private sector must come together. Partnerships with industry and private investments in the infrastructure, capabilities, and access to technology are becoming more crucial than ever, especially in an era where technology has national security implications. The change in the landscape, in many ways, is best illustrated if one thinks about the dawn of the internet era 30 years ago. For those who remember, 30 years ago, when the internet first became a thing, governments and universities had the fastest connection. Today, when you think about who has the fastest access or the best access to the latest in AI technologies, I'd argue it's not universities and not governments anymore. And so we must think, how do we bridge that gap? One of the examples is from the US. Microsoft was pleased to be a part of the US National AI Research Resource announcement a few months ago, but this was intended exactly to address that gap I just highlighted, which was a partnership with the US government, the private sector, to figure out how do we make excuse me, the best AI resources available, more broadly to academics, to researchers. Recent infrastructure announcements by Microsoft in Asia also reflect this dynamic. 6 months ago, Prime Minister Albanese joined Microsoft's President Brad Smith in Washington, D.C., to announce a $5 billion investment in Australia to expand cloud computing, strengthen cybersecurity, and provide AI skills. In March, I was in the Philippines as part of the US Presidential Trade and Investment Mission, where Microsoft announced its commitment to accelerate the use of AI in the Philippines by advancing skilling, connectivity, and cyber resilience. Interestingly, this particular trade mission included not just US Secretary Raimondo, but also Admiral Aquilino, the head of US Indo-PACOM at the time. Again, a clear reflection of the increasing intersection between economic and national security. And last month, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announced $2.2 billion in support for Malaysia's digital infrastructure and $1.7 billion for Indonesia's digital future. In this context, I'd be remiss if I did not mention AUKUS. AUKUS is another example of cooperation and collaboration going beyond governments and militaries. AUKUS is creating unprecedented opportunities for the Australian Defence Industrial Base to gain access to opportunities across the alliance. Through AUKUS, the technology Australia will have access to is also unprecedented. Hyperscale cloud is a foundation for AUKUS as technology and cybersecurity play an increasingly important role in national security, and Microsoft is pleased to be supporting AUKUS. AUKUS demonstrates how partnerships are a crucial force multiplier for collective resilience. There is also a flip side. Partnerships can also be a force multiplier for our adversaries. We should assume and prepare for the likelihood that leading sources of nation-state cyber attacks, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, will work together in the future. We are already seeing evidence that China and Russia are coordinating on misinformation campaigns. All four are well-resourced and highly capable. But they also have strengths in unique areas that will allow them to be more effective together. A strong lattice work will absolutely be necessary to defend like-minded countries against these future cyber attacks. Similarly, nation-state adversaries are already using AI to increase their capabilities, and accordingly, the risk posed by nation-states and other cyber actors who are finding new and more sophisticated ways to attack governments, businesses, and individuals. This reality should be a wake-up call for all of us, including governments in the region, many of which talk about leveraging AI and using it in everything they do. The reality is that many of them are quite far from being able to fully leverage AI. The beginning steps for many governments are yet to be completed. And for me, that starts with moving data into structured data sets, getting it onto the cloud so that it can be fully leveraged and easily deployed to gather insights. In part because of advances in technology, the cybercrime economy is expected to increase threefold, from $8 trillion this past year to $24 trillion in 2027. Hyperscale cloud and AI are part of the solution. A key advantage is simply the economies of scale and the ability to leverage the latest technologies cost-effectively. Every second, Microsoft processes over 750 million data points using sophisticated data analytics and AI algorithms to understand and protect against digital threats. We block 4,000 attacks per second and track more than 300 threat actors globally. That reflects the economies of scale that, quite frankly, only a few providers can provide. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that Microsoft itself is not immune from attacks and will continue to be a target as we remain vocal in our desire to partner with governments to combat the evolving threat from malign cyber actors. We have accepted the US Cybersecurity Safety Review Board's recent recommendations following our own targeting by Chinese state-sponsored hackers, and have launched internally a Secure Future initiative to ensure our services and culture prioritize security. As Microsoft's President Brad Smith highlighted to the US House Committee on Homeland Security just last week, we do not view these steps as a to-do list to check off. Rather, they are reflective of our corporate-wide and permanent shift to place security above all else. These recent hacks should be a wake-up call, not just to Microsoft, but to the entire industry. It highlights the risk of underestimating one's adversaries. And if there was ever any doubt about what the other options are, including building IT solutions and systems that are not connected to the internet. I wanted to call out an example that I recently experienced in the region. Spoke to a government official responsible for cybersecurity. I won't name the country. He commented that his official work email was sufficiently locked down that he could only access it from his government office. The reality is that this solution is not air-gapped. By definition, in order to send an email, you have to be connected to the internet. The other interesting dynamic was that he acknowledged that he ends up using consumer email services for all of his day-to-day work. The reality is it wasn't functional for him to only access email when he was in his government office. And as a result, he used consumer emails, and that became the default even when he was in the office, because it wasn't manageable to use 2 email addresses. So what is the path forward? I'm not going to suggest I have all the answers. I do think one path is to create mechanisms or the lattice for trusted collaboration and interoperability. These mechanisms will require legal reform and technological changes. Recent discussions about Japan joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS reflect the importance of collaboration and creating a lattice that fully leverages the best technologies from like-minded countries. The discussions have also raised questions about whether Japan has in place the necessary legal framework, export controls, and technology, including cybersecurity safeguards, to enable collaboration and the sharing of sensitive information. The sharing of cyber attack and threat information is another area where trusted collaboration and interoperability will become increasingly important. Microsoft recently partnered with the Australian Signals Directorate on the Cyber Shield, or MAX, Microsoft ASD Cyber Shield, which has already shown how public-private partnerships can enhance law enforcement by helping identify the cyber criminals involved in the Metabank hack. MAX is built on a common technology framework, but to scale, we will also need a common legal framework. I've been impressed by the ongoing policy discussions in Australia about no-fault, no-liability reporting, as well as a limited use obligation on regulators for reported cyber incident information. Ultimately, we must get to a place where governments have a real-time dashboard of cyber attack and threat information, not just information across government, but also information across critical infrastructure and private sector. Furthermore, that information must be structured and set up in a way that it can be shared with other like-minded governments in real time. In conclusion, a strong lattice work, undergirded by secure technology, will be critical to ensuring the national security of countries and the stability of the region. Governments and the private sector need to work collaboratively to deliver prosperity and security, especially in this AI era. We should start with the basics. We should ensure there's a secure email system. And then we can tackle technical and legal reforms necessary to share more sensitive information through AUKUS and other security structures. There's never been a greater need, nor better tools to advance the stability, security, and prosperity among like-minded partners and allies. Thank you.
Welcoming back, thank you very much, Mike. Welcoming back Emily to the stage and also Professor Kazuto Suzuki that we heard from yesterday. Just reminding you that Professor Suzuki gives us a very important perspective from Japan that was picked up by Mike just then. Professor Suzuki is the Director of Economic Security at the Institute of Geoeconomics in Tokyo and also a Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the University of Tokyo. So let's move now to this panel discussion about technology after those very interesting perspectives we just got from Emily and Mike. Now, it's going to be a real treat, this panel, because we are going to really dive into things like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, all the buzzwords, but we're going to do so properly. We're actually going to figure out what that means in an economic security context. Before we do that, and it's going to be a real treat, but you're just going to suffer briefly for a minute first, and you're going to suffer a quick, long-term strategic perspective on what strategic technology is and why we're going to discuss on this panel the way that governments decide to define it and what the opportunities and risks are that come out of that. So the suffering is a result of my life choices. I'm sorry about that. Alan Beattie, when he opened the conference, sensibly said that he has avoided the life mistake of trying to do sustained, cogent academic thought on economic security. I took another fork in the path, Alan, and that has been my life for the past couple of years. But what that has revealed is that we've been talking about things like strategic goods and technology. Well, the PhD says as far back as ancient Greece. I'm not going to take you there. I'm just going to take you briefly to the Cold War. So doing research for the United States Study Center on Economic Security, I was reading documents from deep in the bowels of the US government during the Cold War, in which serious government officials were debating whether baseballs were a strategic good that could not be sent from the US, could not be exported to the Soviet Union. This was a serious discussion, okay? And the reason they were debating that is there was a thought that this would actually boost morale amongst citizens in the Soviet Union, and this could even boost troop morale. Now, I think this raises two important thoughts. The first one is that for anyone that's been taken by well-meaning Americans to a baseball game, suffered for 5 hours in the heat, drinking weak American beer, and leaving a couple of kilos heavier after having oversized American snacks. Sorry, Mike. The first thought that should occur to you was maybe the strategic play was send the baseballs. But the second serious thought is there were officials who were actually doing something serious here. They were trying to think about ways to avoid conflict, genuinely thinking about goods and ways to restrict technology that could actually potentially save lives and further the US's strategic ambitions. So with that framing, I do want to turn to the panel and say, let's fast forward to today. What's sort of the strategic technology debate today? What are these strategic technologies? What are the goods or the inputs that feed that technology frontier? And why are we working on defining it? We'll come to opportunities after that. But let's start with that defining question. Perhaps we haven't heard from Professor Suzuki yet this morning, so maybe turning to you.
Right. Thank you very much. I never thought that the baseball was a strategic item, but when I did my my research on export control, I found it very interesting to find the wagon of the galley of the commercial airliner is listed as the dual-use goods, and I think it's a sort of a similar context that, you know, if you provide the meal services in the airline, then it makes people more stronger and healthier. So I think probably you know, there's a lot of different definitions of what strategic means. I think when we discuss in Japan about the strategic or the economic security in general, there are 4 elements about what defines strategic and non-strategic issues. One, whether we are over-dependent on one single country, particularly the hostile country. 2 is the security implications, whether this has, I mean, if you depend on the T-shirt, you know, for a particular country, that doesn't mean that it has the security implications. And I think that that has a strong link to what Emily says in the keynote speech. And the third is the foreign availability, and especially if there are available suppliers outside of Japan and in particularly the friendlier, you know, friends and allies, like-minded countries, then that will be another criteria. And the fourth, whether it has future industrial implications. So, you know, green technology, AI, you know, all these things. I mean, AI, of course, has security implications. So when there was a discussion about semiconductor export control that the United States had launched in 2022, there were certain discussions between the United States authorities and Japan to whether to, Japan to follow the U.S. export control. And at the end of the day, in July 2023, Japan has decided to list 23 items as the control on the control list. And even though it wasn't specifically named a particular country as a destination, but on the operationally speaking, it was there was a clear understanding that the export to China, it will not be licensed. Yeah. So that was an understanding, and one of the major issue was that the balance between the company strategy and the government strategy. And I think at the end of the day, the security implication was the key issue that makes to convince the industry that this is important, and it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that the China will not have an access to the high-end chips, so that they won't be able to use that for the military purposes. And I think that's quite different from the discussion of the green technology, for example. I mean, green technology, yes, it has a certain security implications, but it's not as explicit as the semiconductor. So I think there are certain ways that there are distinction between what is strategic and what is not. And I think this security implication is the key issue. And I think Emily's discussion of how to see whether this items or technology is related to the national security is the key issue. And I'd like to mention that from the Japanese point of view, the security implications are, even though there are security implications, there are certain ways that Japan is lagging behind the US-China competition in the technology. For example, the AI. There is some useful web tool called a Tech Tracker by the ASPI. I'm not sure if this is an appropriate place to use the ASPI's data, but the ASPI has mentioned that the AI algorithm, China is the first, United States is second, and Japan is at 21st place. So, and machine learning of the AI is that China is the first, the United States is the second, and Japan is in the 11th place. So what does it mean? We are now in the position to catch up with the two leading countries, and I think we don't have the luxury to control itself. We are the receiving end of the technology. We are not afraid of somebody taking our technology away. We are the one who needs to learn and take the technology from those countries. And I think this is the different perception. I mean, because of the Japan's backwardedness in these strategic technologies, that makes it a very different position in terms of the controlling technology for the strategic purposes. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you, really interesting. And that sort of leads really well, I think, to Emily, and anything you'd like to add maybe on that framing of why is artificial intelligence considered so strategic and important, and therefore things like the role of semiconductors in that?
Yeah, maybe let's break down a bit what we're talking about when we say AI, right? Because we're not talking about like your Netflix movie recommendations or your little chatbots, right? What we're really concerned about from a strategic perspective in terms of what could matter on a future military conflict, we're really talking about the frontier AI models. Right. And today, I mean, they're still kind of crude. They make lots of weird mistakes. Like they tell you to put glue on your pizza and eat rocks. Like there's all sorts of weird stuff that comes out of them now. But even with them as fairly rudimentary, you can see where they're going, and we can already start to see some of the harms or capabilities that these sorts of frontier AI systems can provide. So for example, if China has access to advanced AI capabilities using advanced AI chips, right, because this is all connected, the compute and the AI capabilities, are they going to be able to do hypersonic missile testing in a much more precise and accurate way? Are they going to be able to do nuclear testing? Wow. Are they going to be able to develop novel biotoxins, right? Like these are not hypothetical, right? So when we're looking at some of the new controls that the US is putting in place, it's really looking at these future capabilities. And the reason that these rules are like so long and complicated is they're really trying to keep it focused on like those advanced capabilities. They don't care about your chatbots or your movie algorithms. What they really want is those advanced capabilities that are going to be quite important strategically.
Fascinating. This is going to be really interesting to bring Mike Yeh in, I think, because you're sitting there at perspective of, you can see, I think, where the government's coming from, and I know you work closely as well with places like the US government. But can you give us a picture, Mike, of, what, apart from the obvious sort of the strategic and military implications that Emily and Professor Suzuki have laid out, but what about for the rest of us, and what are the opportunities, and how do we responsibly manage some of those risks from the commercial perspective?
Yeah, no, so I'm completely aligned with what Emily and Professor Suzuki have outlined in terms of the prospects and why AI is considered strategic. I do think it's interesting when you think back. I remember 18 months ago when ChatGPT first launched, everyone was asking questions around, is this going to be an existential threat, right, to humans? And then it's like, after like 3 months of using ChatGPT, people were like, no, this is not going to be an existential threat. But I agree with Emily, and I think most governments are focused on this properly, which is, even if it's not a threat today, strategic or existential, what does the future look like? And then the other thing I would add on to Emily's comment, absolutely, there's a national security and defense component to this, but I would also think I'd kind of bring it back to the economic security piece. We tend to focus a lot on generative AI today, but the reality is AI has huge potential to really transform other industries as well. So anything that is data intensive. I think about pharmaceutical research. I think about mining and natural resources. And so those are just examples where I think there's definitely also an economic security component to that as well. But I agree, I think the regulation's on the right track. I think the challenge is trying to anticipate the future and regulate the future. But that's the task we're given, and I feel like we're in partnership with governments and industry, we're trying to find the right balance there.
Oh, very interesting. And I mean, do you have anything you can tell us as well about how you're doing that across Asia? I'm just thinking some examples for us would really help us sort of understand it in practice with countries that you're working with.
Yeah, so let me start with actually Microsoft's own approach to this. Early on, and I would argue we're probably one of the leaders in terms of trying to think about what does responsible AI look like. And so internally, about 3 years ago, we defined what we call sensitive use cases. And in hindsight, they feel pretty obvious. They're actually still very hard to operationalize, but I'll walk through the 3 of them. One is obviously anytime AI is making a health decision, right? So you think about physical well-being, medical decisions. That's a sensitive use for us. Second one is what we call consequential financial decisions. So where AI is making judgments on mortgage applications. I would argue even thinking about job applications, right? More and more now, resumes and CVs are going through an AI filter. And so we should understand the biases in that and be clear about what's happening in that process. The third is where we think there are human rights implications. Yeah. The biggest example there is when you think about like mass surveillance, when AI is being used in a mass surveillance context, right? What's happening there behind the scenes in terms of the biases, what are they looking for, but more importantly, what are the mitigations that should be put in place?
Fantastic. Throwing back to the government lens for a minute, so moving back a bit more to Emily and Kazuto, you mentioned, Emily, in your opening remarks that you have ideas about better ways that bureaucracies could actually manage these sort of issues. I mean, I think you come at it, it seems, from more of an economic statecraft lens. How do you set up the bureaucratic landscape to deal with that? Now, it sounds like you have ideas for how the US could do that, and I know that from the Japanese perspective, Kazuto also has thoughts on the Japanese experience here. So could you give us some of those gold nuggets and insights into how we sort of keep up, from the government perspective with that evolving landscape? What could we do with our sort of institutions and our setup that way?
Yeah, there's so much we could do. Part of it candidly comes down to budgets. Secretary of Commerce Raimondo has been very vocal that their budget has not changed in over a decade, right? So that's before the rise of Xi, it's before Russia invaded Ukraine. When you think of like all of the mandates and mission that our export control agencies are being given, their budget hasn't changed substantially for the most part. So part of it is just we need to resource these agencies. But then part of it is how do you spend that money? I do think there's a real need to have an evaluation and analytic capability, right? So objective, economists or industry experts who can help assess whether controls are working, right? So we're doing all sorts of crazy new innovative things with export controls, extraterritorial application for indirect product rules, using them as a sanctioning instrument. Is any of this working? And I think we have some real hard questions that we need to look at in that respect. So part of it's the evaluation and the analytics, and that's backward looking and forward looking, right? Like ideally, we should have that sort of kind of crack analytic team looking at future proposed rules to determine, are they going to work? Are they going to work over time? And what are the second and third order consequences? And particularly, are they going to work if the US is the only one that's imposing the controls, right? And so, I think there's some of this going on in the agency, but I think there's a lot more that could be done. The last thing I'll note is I do think we need to have a bit of a strategic planning function in these economic agencies as well. We've talked already at this conference about things being in silos, right? And it tends to be that things will come together, the agencies will come together, including with the defense community, like when there's a crisis, right? So, Russia invaded Ukraine, there was this massive response around sanctions and export controls, and how do you do that in tandem with arms support, et cetera? I don't think any of that's happening with respect to like future crisis or conflict scenarios related to China, right? And that's a massively more complex problem. It will take years to figure that out. And if we actually are thinking of a time horizon in the next decade, we're too late, right? So we need that strategic planning function with people who can kind of speak the same language as the military, who does their own strategic planning, think about how to use economic tools in tandem with military tools as we think about deterrence, as we think about potential conflict scenarios. And again, none of that is actually happening to any scale in the government now.
Right. I think this, when we talk about the AI, one of the very impressive images that I get is when Prime Minister Kishida has visited the United States in April, there was alongside of the Prime Minister, there are a number of ministers went along, and there were a number of MOUs has concluded between the government agencies, and one of which was the AI related MOU, and which was signed by the Secretary Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, and Mr. Moriyama, the Minister for Education, Science and Technology. So usually the counterpart of the Secretary Raimondo is the Mr. Saito, the Minister for Economy, Trade and Industry. But it was the Mr. Moriyama who is doing the science and technology issue. So that gives a very strong image that Japan still think that AI is the science and technology issue, not the commercial issue. And we are not talking about the businesses of using AI or how to control and how to promote the AI. Right. It was basically the science and technology issues. And I think the numbers that I referred to as an ASPE data, these are basically based on the number of the papers and the patents and all these impressions of the scientific research. And scientifically, Japan is still lagging behind. But in terms of the commercial use of AI, that's a different story. And we have more applications using AI and to make it as a socially, the social applications, including security applications. But I think, this is still the Japanese system is remaining that this technology issue remains in the hands of the Science and Technology Ministry. So I think that's one of the big problem when it comes to the economic security and the technology. So there's a very thin link or very weak link. On the other hand, in terms of the security or the resilience of supply chain in Japan, the system has much more better coordinated alongside with the Prime Minister's office. There's an office of the economic security, and this office has more very strong coordinating power to the different ministerial sectors. So I think because of the law, the Economic Security Promotion Act provides a certain authority for the Prime Minister office to control and coordinate and the planning for the economic security. But when it comes to the technology, that's a different issue. So I think this is one thing that we need to tackle in the future.
Thank you. We've got enough time now for one final question, and there will be time for a question from the audience, so have a think about that. So this is a question related to yesterday's polling results. Yesterday in the polling results, the second biggest threat identified by the audience, both from a Indo-Pacific-wide and Australian perspective, was about cyber and hacking risks. So a question to the panel, anyone can take a bite, but I am looking a little bit at you, Mike. What can we do if we all think this is such a big threat? It'll be interesting this afternoon to find out if that is sustained as one of the biggest threats identified by this audience. So what are we doing? What can be done about this regional vulnerability?
So I'm going to reframe the question a little bit, because I think it's not just about hacking, but I also think we should be increasingly thinking more about misinformation and disinformation. And I don't think we actually talk enough about that. And so key for me across both of those issues is attribution, and figuring out how as governments, as industry, we do more to attribute, and quite frankly, to raise awareness of the issues, right? And this is where I think, especially with disinformation, misinformation, I think we are already starting to see just the proliferation of those issues, especially in this year of elections. And so figuring out how do we be transparent about when there's misinformation. It relates to AI too. Some of this is ultimately about how do we label AI generated content. And I think there's also a huge learning curve around how do we educate citizens and consumers of this content, right? So they understand. I think we have to figure out what's the right labeling, what needs to be disclosed, but more importantly, what is it that consumers should take away from that, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us just to raise the bar in terms of having a conversation and making it part of the public discourse.
Thank you. Before we go to the audience question, anyone else on the panel?
I'd like to, well, first of all, in terms of cyber hacking and the cybersecurity issue, Japan is notorious about this. So I think we need to work on that. That's one thing. But talking about the question of misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation, I think what is interesting from my perspective is that there are, because of the, because people talk about it, there are more awareness improved, and there's a much, improvement in the literacy of the, not just the media or the government people, but also the ordinary general public to understand that there is something called the misinformation or disinformation, and because of the emergence of AI, people become more concerned or aware of these problems. And I think this awareness is already, I think this awareness is a starting point. And if I look, I was in Taiwan when there was an election of the president, and I think there were a number of misinformation and disinformation operations by China to reduce the chances for the William Lai to win. But I think it was interesting that the Taiwanese people are very much aware of these kind of attacks, and they anticipated that this kind of things happen. So I think this public awareness is extremely important when it comes to the fighting against the misinformation.
Fantastic. We're running out of time here, so please can you thank this fantastic panel who've managed to talk about the tip of the spear without getting too much into the widget. Thank you.